Hi everyone, welcome to my screencast. I will be going over a sample DBQ question that has been modified for the new 10-point rubric for this year's 2020 exam. On your screen you'll see on the left the DBQ. Hopefully you have already downloaded this and looked at it, looked at the question, looked at all of the documents, and have done all the brainstorming in terms of analyzing the documents. Because the screencast will only cover the essay portion of the DBQ. So let me first start off by looking at the question from this sample DBQ. Essentially what I did was I took the 2019, so last year's DBQ question from the test, and I have changed it to fit the criteria for this year. So out of the 7, I eliminated 2, so therefore we only have 5 documents in this essay question. The prompt says, evaluate the extent to which the Portuguese transformed maritime trade in the Indian Ocean in the 16th century. So when we look at this question, it's a very straightforward question. It's asking for change. Okay, even though that's not the word that is being used here in the prompt, how did the presence of the Portuguese change the maritime trade that have existed in the Indian Ocean for centuries? And so we're talking about the 16th century here. They've given us a time frame, and that is literally just the 1500s. Okay, but we know that the Portuguese are going to make their way in the late 1400s and then make their presence known in the 1500s. The DBQ begins by this showing you this image of a map. Now, it says here that this is not one of the 7 documents. Now, this is because I took this from last year's DBQ, but it could certainly have something like this on your DBQ where they give you a map or something to give you some historical background. And so this map is great because it has some of the major trade cities within the Indian Ocean that the documents will be indicating. So it gives you a visual, which is nice, but this is not to be included into your essay. On the right side of your screen, I have basically the essay to this prompt. I wrote this essay to show you how to earn all 10 points. So what I did was, after looking at the 5 documents, I looked at to see, are there some similarities that are being expressed by the document? So I grouped them, like you would normally do, that I've taught you guys to do. And as you can see here, I grouped documents 1 and 3 together because it sounded like these documents were expressing that the Portuguese were using force to make their way into the Indian Ocean trade. And then I indicated basically that documents 2 and 5 kind of express how the Muslims have been dominating in the Indian Ocean, and that the Europeans, particularly the Portuguese, are going to make their way. They're going to introduce themselves into a Muslim-dominated region. So having done the grouping, I'm basically going to come up with my thesis statement. So my thesis statement, as reflected from what I saw from the documents, states this. The Portuguese have changed maritime trade in the Indian Ocean in the 16th century by forcibly taking control of important trade cities and threatening a network dominated by the Muslims. So I wrote this thesis based on what I thought the documents were expressing. And I thought that they were, here's my first claim, is that they were forcibly taking control, and also that they were becoming a threat to a region that was dominated by Muslims. Now that I have my thesis statement, I can now clearly think back to the historical background that's going to lead me to this thesis statement. So I'm going to start off my context here. The 15th century was a turning point in world history as Europeans navigated far into the oceans for the first time. So I'm starting with a very broad statement. The Portuguese led the way of exploration through the generous sponsorship of Prince Henry the Navigator, who funded the scientific research, as well as the expedition. Spain soon followed after the Reconquista in 1492, as they desired to expand their Christian empire. The incredible efforts made by the monarchs to support these expeditions led the way for Europeans to encounter a centuries-old trade network of the Indian Ocean. Muslims have had a strong presence in this ocean since the expansion of the Islamic empires in the 7th century. With the rise of the Ottomans in the 15th century, Europeans sought to bypass the Muslim middleman to find a direct route to the centuries of the East. Now you will see here I have 3 terms that I have highlighted. And the reason why I've highlighted these terms is to show you that I've indicated 3 major historical developments in my context, which is important for you to do, because it really shows the extent of your knowledge of this time period. So the rule of thumb is to add 3, okay, and not just mention them, but kind of discuss them very briefly, because you do have to do 3 in your context. And the last thing I did was basically take the thesis statement and put it at the end of my intro sentence. So I've already earned 2 points here in my first paragraph. Let's go to body paragraph number 1, which is going to highlight my first claim. And that first claim is forcibly taking control by the Portuguese. So here the Portuguese entered into the Indian Ocean Trade Network with force in order to monopolize all the valuable items. I basically restated in my topic sentence my first claim. When Vasco da Gama first entered the Indian Ocean trade, he discovered that the Europeans did not have the commodities for an even exchange. The items in this trade were far more valuable than what the Europeans could offer. However, the Portuguese had an advantage that soon tipped the balance. Their superior firearms allowed them to force major cities to relinquish their control over to the Portuguese. Their presence quickly spread through the trade network, which became a major concern to some Muslim merchants. And here what I've done is basically taken the content of document 1 to cite document 1. Okay, so I'm not going to just say, oh, document 1 says. No, I'm going to cite something what I read from the document and then write in parentheses document 1. Because what this shows is that I understand and I've correctly interpreted the evidence. Now that is what you're supposed to do, as you can see from this rubric. Under evidence, you are supposed to use the content of the document to address the topic of the prop. Okay, so here we see that you have to earn at least 3 here by citing at least 2, but we don't want to do 2, we want to do 4. Now moving on here, after I have cited document 1, the advice given to the Hindu ruler of Calicut by the Muslim merchant indicates that the Portuguese did not have the right intention to safely reside on the Indian continent, but to make war. And here what I am doing is support my claim in the thesis. I am connecting this document back to my thesis statement. Okay, and that's really important for you guys to do. You have to do that for all 4 documents that you're going to cite. 4 at least of the 5. And here his purpose was to convince the Hindu rulers that the Portuguese were not to be trusted and that their true intent was to take possession of the city. So here I basically outlined one of the hit. This is the analysis point that you're supposed to earn. So here I have outlined, analyzed the document and stated the purpose. So remember that this is a Muslim merchant of India basically writing to another Hindu ruler. So basically he is indicating that the Portuguese do not have the right motivation, and he's trying to convince the Hindu ruler not to make contact with the Portuguese. And so that is my purpose here. In addition, the Muslim ruler of Aceh also understood the aggressive nature of the Europeans, as he writes to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Going to document 3, here is a ruler of the Sultan of Aceh. Now we're like, where is the Sultanate of Aceh? It says here a Muslim state on the island of Sumatra, Indonesia. So this is some kind of a sultanate, meaning that it is ruled by a Muslim, even though it's in Indonesia, and he's writing to the Ottoman Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And I've cited content from this document to basically cite the source, which is document 3. The ruler of Aceh implores the Ottoman Sultan that the Portuguese have destroyed their ships and that they behave like pirates near the Maldive Islands. So here I am connecting this support my claim in the thesis that they are aggressive. And so the Aceh understands the aggressive nature of the Portuguese because he's experienced it. And he is writing to the Ottoman for some kind of a purpose, and that is what I am indicating in the next sentence. He wrote this letter as one Muslim ruler to another to request more weapons to fight against the European aggression. So in this, I have basically analyzed this document, and I'm using purpose because he understands that the Portuguese are going to go to war with them and that they have burned down even Ottoman ships. And so the purpose of this ruler is to seek some kind of support, which is in the form of weapons to fight the Portuguese. It is clear that the use of firearms and superior technology have benefited the Portuguese in their attempt to infiltrate into the trade network. The development of the caravel allowed them to navigate far into the Indian Ocean, as well as the new technology of cannons on their ship. So here what I am doing is using outside evidence, and I have basically used it to support the fact that the Portuguese have the upper hand because of the new technology. So here is my outside evidence. And for this year's DBQ, I am keeping this super short. Normally I would maybe even write 2 sentences for outside evidence, but because we only have 45 minutes, technically 35 minutes after 10 minutes of reading, I want you guys to be concise and get to the point and then move on, okay? Now in my body paragraph 2, I'm going to basically go back to my thesis and focus on my second claim, which is the entrance of the Europeans into a Muslim-dominated network. The Portuguese have changed maritime trade, which had been dominated by Muslims. The letter by a Portuguese court official to the King of Portugal indicates the growing competition between them and the Ottoman Empire. Doc 2. So here is my Doc 2. This is one Portuguese to another, a Portuguese court official to the King of Portugal. So it's really important that you guys understand who is writing the document, because it really gives you an insight to the motivation, the purpose, as well as the point of view of the document. So I've cited the content to basically cite the source, which is Doc 2. Due to the strong Muslim presence in the Indian Ocean, the author believes that the treaty with the Ottoman may intensify the Muslim stronghold, which already exists. The Ottoman presence in the Indian Ocean will only add to the Muslim strength. So I use these 2 sentences to basically support my claim in the thesis. The author tries to discourage the peace treaty the King of Portugal is considering and argues that they will lose out on the business in the end. Here is my analysis of the document, which I am going with purpose again. He is trying to convince the king not to sign this peace treaty. Their gradual inclusion in this trade is apparent, especially when items, when items such as the precious inlaid box are created specifically to target the Portuguese customer. Doc 5. I am now going into this document, which is this box, which a lot of students were confused with last year. Now the source tells us that this box is, we don't really know what the purpose of it is for, but we do know that it is a luxury item. It is made in India, and it's made to go to Portugal. And it's made out of really expensive items, teak, ebony, and other precious hardwoods with ivory details. We know this is probably something expensive. And we can see in the details that there is a European, most likely a Portuguese, embellished on the box. And so I basically couldn't describe the box to cite this document. This expensive item created in India reveals that their new European customer had the demand and the need for luxury items. This supports the idea that the Portuguese have made their way into the Indian Ocean market, which had been dominated by the Muslims. And for this document, I basically decided to do the analysis first. And for here, I did the audience. I said that the audience was the Portuguese customer. And because this was specifically made for them. This supports the idea that the Portuguese have made their way into the Indian Ocean market, which had been dominated by the Muslims. Again, connecting it back to my thesis, support my claim in the thesis. That the Europeans are now coming in. They are part of this Indian Ocean trade network, which had been dominated by the Muslims. And moving on, moreover, the discovery of the New World and silver from the Americas will be used increasingly to purchase the spices and luxury goods by the Europeans. Here I am using silver as my outside evidence. We know that the Spanish and the Portuguese are going to draw out, mostly coming from the Spanish, the silver and the gold that's coming from the Americas, and it's going to make its way into the various trade networks, including the Indian Ocean. And so I'm going to use silver as my outside evidence. And I'm going to stop my body paragraph there because I've basically touched upon all the points in my two body paragraphs. So going back, before I go to the complexity paragraph, I want to summarize all the points. I have in my intro 2 points, my context and my thesis. I have basically used all 4 of the 5 documents, so document 1, 3, 2, and 5. I have supported all 4 documents back to my claim in the thesis, which is 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, and so that earns me 3 points. Because if you look back at this rubric, it says 1, 2 here, and then the evidence I've used all 4, and I've supported my argument using all 4, which is the 3 points for evidence here, and 2 here, which makes it 5. The 2 additional points for evidence is for the evidence beyond the document, which I have used here for technology, outside evidence here, the caravel and the cannons, and then the cannons and the ships, and then the outside evidence of silver here. So that is an additional 2 points, which takes me to 7. Moving on into the analysis and reasoning, you earn 1 point for one of the hips that you use for the documents. If you use a hip for 2 documents, you earn 2. Now, I've done hip for all 4, so that means I've done more than the minimum requirement of 2. So that, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4. So that earns me an additional 2 points for analysis. So that takes me to 9. Now, I could basically 9 out of 10 is a really, really good score. Okay, but let's see how we can earn the complexity point here. Now, what I'm going to do for the complexity point, now going back to the rubric, the complexity point is the same as we have done in the past DBQs and the LEQ. Because I told you that the complexity point is very difficult to earn in AP World, I'm going to show you 4 different ways to earn the complexity point. Okay, just so that you can get a good understanding of, okay, how am I supposed to tackle this? The first complexity point I'm going to do is trying to include that 5th document that I did not use in my body paragraphs, because I thought that this 5th document was kind of a rogue document, kind of a standalone document, because it did not fit nicely with the argument that I was trying to make. So what the College Board wants to do is try to see if you can somehow bring it in. Now, how am I going to do that? I'm going to use that to show limitations to my claim. Although the arrival of the Portuguese into the Indian Ocean trade network threatened the existing infrastructure by the use of their superior technology, the centuries-old tradition of commerce established by the locals continued to remain intact. As indicated by the Venetian trader, Caesar Federici, the Hindu brokers of India continued to maintain their role despite the presence of the Portuguese. Document 4. As newcomers to the trade, the Portuguese may not have understood how to barter properly with the locals. It appears that the Hindus knew how to maximize their profit by selling lower quality products, in this case to the Portuguese. Although the Portuguese had established themselves as aggressive pirates in the Indian Ocean, the local people continued to maintain the upper hand in the business as they have practiced their trade for centuries, which makes sense. If these people in the Indian Ocean, merchants and the trade cities, have been doing this for centuries, they understand the system. They are deeply embedded in the trade network. And so because the Portuguese are Europeans and they are new, they are only discovering how things work. And it makes sense that the locals will continue to have the upper hand, right? And so that is the argument I'm going to show using document 4, because that's what I felt like document 4 was saying, that it looked like the Portuguese still were somehow incompetent as traders in this Indian Ocean trade. Going to the second complexity point, I'm going to use a different skill. Now, I'm not going to just use one skill, I'm going to use 2 different skills. Remember that the question, the prompt was asking about change, okay? So what I'm going to use continuity and I'm going to use effect. Instead of just using continuity, I'm going to use 2. Okay, so I think that is a good rule of thumb for you guys to try to earn this complexity point. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to infiltrate into the Indian Ocean network, but they will not be the last. Other nations such as the British, Dutch, and the French will eventually make their way into the Spice Islands in the 17th through the 18th centuries. The powerful joint stock companies such as the British and the Dutch will eventually overtake the Portuguese to create a monopoly of their own. The superiority of European technology and scientific progress will overshadow the East, which shifts the balance of power towards the West. The Europeans, who were considered economically inferior in the Middle Ages, will now come to dominate the trade network of the East and use their firearms to colonize areas such as India, Indonesia, and Southeast Asia. These colonies will provide precious raw materials that will result in tremendous economic growth for Europe. So what is the continuity? I'm showing that although the Portuguese were the first to introduce into the Indian Ocean, they're going to be followed suit by the British, Dutch, and the French, who will basically dominate by coming into the Spice Islands in the next centuries. And we know that the powerful joint stock companies will be leading the way. That is the continuity, because I'm taking you into the next centuries. The effect I'm going to show is now the shifting in the balance of power, which is going to basically show favorably towards the Europeans, and how they are going to, by the 17th and 18th centuries, are going to colonize this region of the Indian Ocean, such as India, Indonesia, and Southeast Asia. India will be by the British, Indonesia by the Dutch, Southeast Asia by the French. And so that is the effect that I'm going to mention that's going to happen later on in the successive centuries to come. The third complexity I'm going to show you is the nuance of the historical development. Nuance meaning variation, that nothing is very clear-cut and that you have to make considerations for other factors. So the Portuguese will encourage other European powers to explore and infiltrate the Indian Ocean trade network. The 2 powerful trading companies of the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company will grow tremendously powerful and rich as a result of their monopoly in the Indian Ocean. The British will eventually colonize India, and the Dutch will claim Indonesia. However, their domination isn't entirely because of European superiority. The decline of the existing empires, such as the Mughals of India, also contributed to its demise. The fragmented empire had lost its power due to internal wars and lack of unity amongst the Hindu and Muslim people of India. As a result, the British were able to slowly gain control due to their internal power struggles. So what is the other factor or variation in this development? That it wasn't entirely because of European superiority, but the other factor is that there's internal weakness of the existing empires. So the Mughals of India is my example, and that because of their empire is fragmented due to internal wars and corruption, as well as the conflict that have existed on the subcontinent between the Hindus and the Muslims. And the British will basically take advantage of that internal weakness, and they will slowly encroach upon the subcontinent and establish themselves as the rulers of India. Ultimately, the British crown taking control in the 19th century and becoming the British Raj. That is the nuance. The fourth complexity that I'm going to show you is how I'm going to connect the development in the Indian Ocean to a different region of the world. And in this time period, make sure that you remember the connection to the Americas, because that is how this is the new area that we are going to see. Although the Portuguese initially showed considerable strength in the Indian Ocean trade network, they will lose out to more powerful European nations such as the British, Dutch, and the Spanish. The Portuguese did not have the manpower nor the resources to uphold their status in the Indian Ocean. They could not compete with the British and the Dutch. Likewise, in the Americas, the Portuguese had claimed parts of South America, such as Brazil. However, the Spanish had the resources and manpower to conquer most of South America, Central America, as well as parts of North America. The new sea-based empires of Europe will expand beyond the Indian Ocean and establish new trade routes, connecting the East to the Western Hemisphere. The rise of the transatlantic trade network will establish a new trend towards globalization. So what is my comparison? I'm comparing the Portuguese to the other European nations, because the Portuguese will initiate contact in the Indian Ocean, but they're going to be weakened compared to the other Europeans, such as the British and the Dutch in the Indian Ocean. Likewise, it's the same in the Americas. The Portuguese have also settled into Brazil, but we know that in comparison to the Spanish, that it's the Spanish who's going to dominate the Americas. So I'm making that comparison between the Portuguese to the other Europeans who will follow suit, but also to two different regions, to the Indian Ocean as well as the Americas. And I'm also introducing a new trade network that is going to arise, which is the transatlantic trade network. You can even continue to discuss the comparison of the transatlantic trade network to the Indian Ocean if you'd like. But because of time, I decided to not move forward. But if you had the time, that would be fantastic to discuss this as well. That will basically are the four different ways to show complexity, okay, in your last body paragraph. And the last thing I want you to do is basically restate your thesis. Remember, don't write it the same way. Change it up so that just in case you don't earn it in the first point, you can earn it in your last, in your conclusion. So hopefully this is helpful in showing you how to earn all 10 points of the new rubric for this year's 2020 exam. So I will end it here. All right, bye guys.